Welcome back to TAC Ops. I'm Greg. I'm here with Eric again, as always.
Howdy, howdy.
And today we have on Dr. John McAdams. He is a researcher of the JFK assassination, a real fascinating guy. But first, our sponsor is the Commando Store. They're an online military surplus store. They have everything from boots to hats, different clothing. I mean, Eric, we've looked through this website before. They have crazy stuff.
Yeah, they're like fake mines.
They have decommissioned landmines and everything. Real
right.
interesting site, though. Go over and check them out. CommandoStore.com. It's Commando with a K. Store.com. You get 10% off. 10% off your first purchase with our coupon code TACOPS. It's all lowercase, no space in between it. CommandoStore.com. All right, Dr. McAdams, thanks for being on.
Oh, good to be here.
So first, maybe you can introduce yourself, go through your background a little bit, and how you got interested in the assassination.
Well, in real life, I'm a political scientist who teaches American politics at Marquette University. And I came to Marquette in 1977 and just taught American politics and published stuff just on American politics. I defined the way political scientists defined it with a lot of charts and numbers. And then in the early 1990s, I got interested in the Kennedy assassination. I got involved in a Usenet news group, which was the way people discuss things online in the early 1990s. And I sort of got drawn into that. And I would see people post things, and I would ask myself, is that true? And then I would go look for the primary source on that. That is, look up the testimony or look up this or that technical report. And I sort of became a debunker. I found out a lot of the things the conspiracists were saying were untrue. And then, like the web was just starting up, going great guns, so I started a web page. So sort of every time I'd find something interesting, usually debunking some conspiracy factoid, I'd put it on my web page, and the web page just sort of, growed like Topsy. And it's been on the web ever since. So and then I decided, hey, since I'm really interested in that, why don't I teach a course on the Kennedy assassination? And indeed, yes, you can teach a course like that, and it's partly sort of history on the ground. By that I mean it's not World War II and what was Hitler thinking and what was Churchill thinking and what was Roosevelt thinking. It's more like, oh, something happened in Dealey Plaza. How do we know what happened? Well, there's witness testimony. Let's look at the witness testimony. There are films. Actually, there are 3 films of the actual shooting sequence. But what do they show, et cetera, et cetera? So it becomes largely a course in looking at primary sources. And of course, that's interesting because a lot of the primary sources contradict other primary sources. Right? There are a bunch of witnesses who thought the shots came from the grassy knoll, or at least one shot came from the grassy knoll, which would imply a conspiracy because that's in front of Kennedy. And a bunch of other witnesses who thought the shots came from the depository or the direction of the depository, which is consistent with the Warren Commission version, which is that Oswald shot Kennedy by himself. So what do you make of all of this? So it's a kind of an interesting exercise. So I've been teaching that course since the early 90s.
Interesting. So as a basic background, there was so after the assassination, you had the Warren Commission. And this was a group of people assigned by President Johnson to investigate the assassination. Because as we know, Oswald, it was only 48 hours later, right? Even less than, I think it was just under 48 hours after the assassination that he himself was murdered. By a guy named Jack Ruby.
That's right.
So we had the Warren Commission, which came out and said there was no conspiracy. And then about, 15 years later, we had the House Select Committee on Assassinations come out, and their final result was there was a conspiracy.
Right.
So
based on the so-called acoustic evidence. They had a firm analyze a recording of what went on in Dealey Plaza supposedly at the time of the shooting, picked up by a cop's microphone, supposedly. That kind of fell apart when it was examined by the National Academy of Sciences. The supposed shots on the recording weren't shots. The microphone was not in Dealey Plaza. It was probably out of the trademark. So what you had there was an example of, and this happens with some frequency, pushing science too far. Mm-hmm. That is, you have some scientists who are kind of on the cutting edge of something, and they have a vested interest in something, and they overstate their findings. They're just a little too eager to prove something, and then it turns out when it's carefully examined, it turns out it's not valid.
So there was a confirmation bias there, then you think. They were really looking for evidence of a conspiracy, and they were honest at least, right? I believe. So the interesting thing to me is a lot of people who do believe in a conspiracy, they like to bring up the House Select Committee or the HSCA as evidence, right, that there was a conspiracy. But
sure,
the HSCA in their findings said that Oswald was up there. He took 3 shots, 2 of which hit the president, and he was responsible for every bullet that hit him.
Yeah, they said there was a shot from the grassy knoll, but it completely missed.
And that kind of goes against the Zapruder film. That's the famous footage that Abraham Zapruder took of the actual assassination. It's probably the one that everyone's most familiar with. That's the film that a lot of people like to point to from the famous Oliver Stone movie, Back and to the Left, how he got shot, and his head blows backward. But it's interesting that the House Select Committee on Assassinations, they said that the grassy knoll shooter missed. Was there any other thing that they based this on, or was it mostly just that acoustical evidence?
Well, it was mostly just the acoustical evidence. People in the House Select Committee, particularly the head staff person, Robert Blakey, says, we had other evidence. And they did have some witnesses in Dealey Plaza who, for example, thought the shots came, or at least one shot came from the knoll. But the vast majority of the witnesses, by their own tabulation, by the way, done by the same firm, Bolt, Baranek, and Newman, that did the first cut at the acoustic evidence, said no, overwhelmingly, the witnesses thought the shots came from only one direction, and that direction was the depository. And it's also the case that we have a draft of the final report that was never published because then in very late hearings, the acoustic evidence came in, and then the House Select Committee said, well, we find an assassination. But the draft before the acoustic evidence came in says flatly there was no conspiracy. So it was really entirely dependent on the acoustic evidence, that finding, because we know what they were saying before the acoustic evidence came in, and it was flatly no conspiracy.
So do you think it was just kind of a coincidence that these sounds that appeared in the acoustical evidence kind of happened to match up the timings, or was it not even that close? So why did they think that this recording was from the actual assassination?
Well, first of all, they didn't start with a clear timing on all the shots, okay? If you knew that there was like one shot at Zapruder frame 155 and then at 223 and then at 313, you could ask if you can, match that. But the House Select Committee thought the first shot happened about Zapruder frame 160, and then another shot at Zapruder frame 190, and everybody agrees on 313. That's when Kennedy's head explodes. Right. So what they did was look for sets of impulses that matched a gunshot. Okay. The problem is they found 15 sets of impulses that matched a gunshot.
Oh, wow.
So what they did is they went through and eliminated the ones that didn't fit, um,
Oh,
any
the timing?
plausible scenario. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, yeah, exactly. They didn't fit any scenario at all. Actually, for example, one they eliminated would have implied the shooter was shooting away from uh, Kennedy's limousine. So they eliminated that. So they eliminated a bunch, and after they eliminated a bunch, they had a scenario they touted, um, and in fact, the scenario pretty much contradicts um, what we know today. For example, the House Select Committee said there was a shot at about Zapruder frame 160, and then a shot at about Zapruder frame 190. Okay, and were both fired by Lee Harvey Oswald. They said. The trouble is you can only cycle the mechanism of Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano and fire that fast if you don't bother to aim.
Mm.
So their scenario explicitly required that Oswald get off a second shot, by the way, through the live oak tree. There were occasional breaks in the foliage, so that's not utterly absurd. But you'd have to bang and then cycle the mechanism, and without aiming, shoot again. In fact, a committee, Robert Blakey himself, if I remember correctly, tried to see how fast you could cycle the Mannlicher Carcano, and yes, you could cycle it that fast if you didn't bother to aim. Okay. It's also the case that people who've looked at the Zapruder film very carefully since, there's strong evidence of a shot at Zapruder frame 223. That would have been the so-called single bullet. The House Select Committee didn't notice that and didn't place any shot at 223. They thought it was 160 and 190, and then I think it was, if memory serves, 285 and then 313. So the whole thing, was a kind of a ramshackle thing. Again, I think it was a matter of trying to push science too far. Something called neutron activation analysis. They thought you could look at, for example, fragments coming from Connolly's wrist and see if they would match Commission Exhibit 399, the so-called magic bullet. And neutron activation analysis is basically just a highly precise chemical test for the chemical composition. And they said, oh yeah, it matches. That turned out to be sort of like the matches for shots and the impulses. Neutron activation analysis has been pretty much discredited since. So that's two cases where they wanted to rely on science, which sounds like a good idea, but you have to be careful if you're talking about untested science. And particularly scientists who have a vested interest in a particular discipline or particular way of viewing things. Some of the science they used had been tested in court, and by peer review for decades. Like when you try to match a bullet to a gun, that's been done for decades. It's accepted in courts. It's widely accepted. So there's established science, and then there's something brand new that somebody has a vested interest in pushing, and it sounds very attractive if it can prove what you want to prove, and then on careful peer review, it falls apart.
So you brought up a thing called the single bullet theory, the magic bullet, right? That's CE 399.
Correct.
Now, a lot of people also refer to this as a pristine bullet. So I have an image here pulled up of Commission Exhibit 399. And from the profile, from the side view, it looks nearly intact, right? But then Eric took the next picture, and you can see it's actually kind of been warped and deformed. Now, this is the bullet that supposedly caused, or that they say caused all the injuries to, it went through Kennedy's throat, or his upper back, out of his throat, and then into Connally, into his wrist, and then buried in his knee, correct?
Buried in his thigh, yeah.
His thigh,
shallow, yeah.
So let's see here. Yeah, go back to the original picture.
Okay.
So why is So why do you think they bring this up? Do you think there's any credibility to their claim that this bullet, would not come out after hitting bone? And I mean, obviously, it
Yeah.
comes up in the Oliver Stone movie that there's no way it could have came out like this, and then just found in the stretcher.
Yeah. First of all, it wouldn't have been deformed going through Kennedy's torso because it, as far as we know, didn't hit bone. There's a fracture in the T1, first thoracic vertebra, the transverse process, that could actually be caused by the bullet passing near. A bullet doesn't actually have to hit bone to fracture it because it sets up a kind of pressure wave in the flesh, but it probably would not have been deformed going through Kennedy. It tumbled through Connolly's torso, upper torso, but apparently did not hit hard bone there. If it hit a rib is soft bone, but the Dallas doctors said what happened was a slap fracture. It simply passed near the rib, shattering it, certainly, driving fragments into Connolly's right lung, but hadn't really hit hard bone there. And then finally it hits Connolly's wrist after it's been radically slowed down to maybe 1,200 feet per second. Muzzle velocity of the Mannlicher Gargano is a little over 2,000 feet per second. And if I remember my physics correctly, kinetic energy is a function of the square of the velocity. So you slow it down to half the speed, it has a lot less kinetic energy. And then it hits Connolly's wrist. But if you look at it end on, it is mashed. It's, it's oval. It's not round. It's mashed. So it's not in any way, it's not pristine at all. And then if it goes into Connolly's thigh, that's soft flesh and it didn't go in very far. So, another thing you might ask is if it was planted, why would conspirators plant a pristine bullet? I mean, presumably exclusion of all other weapons, they had to have control of Oswald's rifle. Why didn't they go shoot up some cattle and find a bullet that looked, plausibly mangled? So that would be an interesting question. Another interesting question would be, why would they plant a bullet that was discovered, at most an hour and a half, probably less, after the shooting, when at that point they would not know, they would not know whether an extra bullet would implicate Oswald and Oswald's rifle, or whether it would be one bullet too many, whether it would be the bullet that showed that one person couldn't have fired the shots, because at that time they could have had no way of knowing how many bullets or bullet fragments would be recovered. So it's kind of reckless to go around planting bullets. When somebody's been shot, you've been shooting at somebody for several shots, and you don't know what's going to be recovered. So the idea that it was planted really doesn't make much sense.
That's with a lot of conspiracy theorist claims. So when you take one individually, they can say, okay, this is evidence of that, or this is evidence of that. But when you start to put them together, they really don't make sense. Like you're saying, if you're going to place bullets, why don't you have a bullet that looks more realistic, like it would do what you're saying? Or one of the other claims is there's a famous photograph where people say that you can see Oswald standing on the front steps, the entrance of the Texas School Book Depository, which is where the shots were fired from. If you really think about it, if you were the person planning this whole thing out, you'd have to know perfectly that Oswald will be alone. He wouldn't have any other alibi or anything. You'd have to know perfectly that at the exact same time Kennedy was driving by, that Oswald would be alone. That way you could blame it on them. Because if he was somewhere else and he was in a photograph or something, that ruins your entire conspiracy. That ruins your entire thing. And
Go ahead.
Oh, and then it manifests itself all over, I think. So, for example, with multiple shooters, they say there was one behind the grassy knoll, and I've heard people say there were as many as 4, 5, 6 shooters total. It just seems crazy to me. Like, why would you want people shooting from every direction? People had cameras there. They had video cameras too. They could have easily captured somebody clearly in an image, or stopped the guy, or grabbed him. I mean, anything.
Sure.
It just seems like a
Oh,
horrible
but they
way to
didn't
plan
have,
a conspiracy.
in the first place, it's showing that you're young because you said video cameras. They had film cameras.
Sorry, yeah.
That my students always make that mistake because they're not as old as I am and they don't remember 8mm film. As for Oswald standing out on the front steps, which some people actually, think they see him there in a photo by a guy named James Alchins. The implication of that is quite simple. Oswald had to be part of the conspiracy in some way. The conspiracy had to be able to manipulate his movements and guarantee that he would not be standing somewhere in plain sight. Now, you can say he was a manipulated patsy who was part of a conspiracy that, had been told to do something but didn't actually know what was going on, and had been convinced to that he was doing something good even, and then was double crossed. But any conspiracy that involves Oswald as completely innocent, in no way involved, no connections whatsoever with the conspirators, just doesn't work.
No. So usually what most conspiracy believers say is that Oswald was part of it, and like you said, he was a patsy, but he was involved in the CIA, for example, or something like that he has a background there. And I've talked to different people at the Dealey Plaza, and it seems like a lot of times they'll say, oh, we know for sure now, we have evidence that he was CIA. So was Oswald CIA, or is there any evidence linking him to any intelligence agencies of the United States?
No, essentially no. When Oswald went to Mexico City, he obviously appeared on the CIA's radar because he visited the Cuban and Soviet embassies. And of course, the CIA was spying on the Cuban and Soviet embassies. As an American taxpayer, I'm happy that we're doing that. For heaven's sakes, that's what we're paying them for. I'd be disappointed if they weren't. But obviously they're wondering, this guy doing there? I mean, for example, there'd been a history of people who had confidential information going to communist embassies and volunteering that they were willing to share it. So, you're an American, you visit the Cuban or Soviet embassies, the CIA wants to know what's happening. And so you get this exchange of memoranda between, and I think actually a cable or two, between the Mexico City station and CIA headquarters at Langley. And what it shows is they didn't know who Lee Oswald was. They did pull out a file on Oswald, which showed that he defected to the Soviet Union and then returned to the U.S. He certainly got on their radar when he did that, which, of course, makes perfect sense. I mean, that's what you do. You look at defectors. You wonder whether, and with the return, you wonder whether some enemy intelligence agency is using them. But it's pretty clear from the internal communications of the CIA that they were wondering what Oswald was up to. I mean, they knew he defected, but they didn't really, they hadn't really figured him out. They didn't know what he was doing, and they had access to the phone calls that were tapping the phones of the Cuban and Soviet embassies. By the way, the CIA was kind of in bed with Mexican security services at the time. As far as we know, there was no human intelligence in the embassies. People have speculated on that, but there's no evidence. So, okay, they had some phone conversations, and they'd figured out who he was, although one memo calls him Lee Henry Oswald, but they were kind of clueless.
So, another thing that many conspiracy theories bring up, if the CIA, the intelligence community, knew that Oswald was a known communist, he defected and came back from the Soviet Union, he was going down to Mexico City, going into the Soviet and the Cuban embassy, why then they bring up the fact that you would never let the president drive right in front of the place that this person worked at? What is your response to that?
Okay, first of all, it's easy to look at Lee Oswald as this great historic figure, this horribly, horribly important person that the FBI should have been tailing the whole time, he was in Dallas, particularly after he visited the embassies. There'd been several defectors to the Soviet Union, somewhere between 20 and 25, who looked in a lot of ways like Oswald. There's something called the defectors study from the House Select Committee that's very good. Generally, they tended to be mentally unstable people who eventually decided they wanted to come back, which by the way, created problems for the State Department, and if they wanted to bring their spouse, Immigration and Naturalization Service. But he wasn't, and as far as people with communist connections, there were a lot, in absolute numbers, a small percentage of the population, but in absolute numbers, quite a large number of them spread all over the U.S. here and there. Agent Hosty in Dallas, who was told about the visit to the Soviet embassy, was supposed to keep track of Oswald. But he had, if memory serves, I haven't looked at his book lately, something like 30 other people or organizations to keep track on, mostly sort of right-wing Klan types. But Oswald was on the list. And sure enough, he did try a couple of times to find Oswald and talk to Oswald. He never succeeded. He went out to Irving and talked to Ruth Payne and Marina Oswald, but never succeeded. So, with hindsight, you can say, gosh, Oswald was this terribly, terribly important person. But he certainly, before he was fingered for shooting Kennedy, seemed to be just a malcontent leftist, and nobody really had any evidence that he had violent tendencies. One partial exception was I've seen one document that said that the CIA or maybe the FBI knew he had is thoroughly nasty, but it doesn't necessarily suggest political violence. They had no idea he'd shot at General Walker. That didn't come out until after the assassination. So it looked just like one of a, malcontent leftist, of which there were, a pretty fair absolute number in the U.S. It's sort of 20/20 hindsight to say, yes, he was this terribly important person. They should have put a tail on him or something.
Right. And I actually just read Hosty's, at least his testimony to the Warren Commission, and it seemed like he was always just one step behind. So I believe he said Oswald was on an open pending closure status case where he interviewed him when he came back from the Soviet Union, and then he had to interview him one more time after 6 months. Or maybe that was his wife. I might be getting the two mixed up. And then after that, the case would be closed. And then he moved to New Orleans, and and then once he found out he moved to New Orleans, he sent the case over there for them to be the head FBI branch. Then he came back to Dallas, and it took a little bit. I mean, this is back in the 60s, right? We don't have the internet. Things were a little bit slower back then. So they had to send the case back over to Dallas, and I believe he, like you were saying, he did check in at the Payne house, talk to Maria, or at least Ruth, to Maria through Ruth, because she did not speak very much English at the time. And I believe the last step before the assassination, I think it was on November 1st, that he was able to find out where he worked, and he called just to verify, and Hosty said that he just wanted to make sure it wasn't any sort of company that worked with the U.S. military or intelligence or anything like that, a contractor. And at that point, like you said, because they didn't have any evidence that he was dangerous or was going to pull anything off like this at the time.
Yeah, it's you have to be careful about judging historical events with 20/20 hindsight.
Right. The other interesting thing about Hosty is the letter that Oswald supposedly left at the FBI office for him. Now, supposedly, so after Hosty met with his wife, Oswald became frustrated, which is understandable, I guess. If he felt like he was being harassed by the FBI. So he went into the FBI's office and he wrote a note and gave it to Hosty. We don't know exactly what that note said. Different conspiracy theorists think it was, a clear threat to do something violent. I believe Hosty just said that it was an unsigned note saying to stay away from my wife. And Hosty thought it might have been from any one of his 30 cases, like you were saying. He didn't know where it came from.
Yeah, in a broad sense, we do know what it said, because Lee Oswald, when he found out that Hosty had come out to Irving to try to interview Lee, but instead, of course, since Lee wasn't there, talking to Marina and through Mrs. Payne, was very unhappy with that. Mrs. Payne said he was disturbed, and both Marina and Mrs. Payne. Well, I know Mrs. Payne said he was going to go complain to the FBI, and this is right before if memory serves, the note was probably on Tuesday because it was a Monday, and Oswald had been home the previous weekend, so he clearly had expressed unhappiness with Hosty bothering his wife. By the way, we know he was unhappy because when he was being interrogated by the Dallas cops, and Hosty walked into the interrogation, Oswald slammed his fist on the table and was really, really mad. So we know he was mad at Hosty about that. We know he told Mrs. Payne that he was going in to complain about that. So the clear implication is that that's what he did. There's a difference about how violent the note is. The receptionist, he gave the note to the receptionist in an open envelope, and the receptionist's name is Nanny Finner. She said, if you don't stop bothering, I'm just paraphrasing here, but if you don't stop bothering my wife, I'm going to blow up the FBI and Dallas police headquarters. Hosty gives a sort of more bland version, if you don't stop bothering my wife, I'm going to take it up with the appropriate people, blah, blah, etc. I actually sort of believe Hosty's version because we've got other examples of Oswald writing to people in authority, as when he wrote to the CC about the bad treatment he thought he'd received at the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. And he didn't use violent language. He was somewhat stilted, almost bureaucratic language. He expressed his discontent. So I actually don't believe Oswald threatened violence. I think he simply showed that expressed being unhappy. As for from whom the note came, Gordon Shanklin, special agent in charge of the Dallas FBI, did call Hosty in on the Sunday, just a few hours after Oswald was shot, telling Hosty to destroy the note. By that time, Hosty or someone had put two and two together, in closing, if Hosty's telling the truth, the note wasn't signed, put two and two together and knew it came from Oswald. So by Sunday afternoon, it was clear that it had come from Oswald.
So I wanna kind of bring us back to a little bit of basics. So one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about was just basic conspiracy theory, right? And because in our prior podcast, we've talked about Area 51, we've talked about UFOs. Greg has actually made a UFO video, like an actual like fake UFO that looks real, like flying away from you and stuff. It's really great. We'll have to pull it up one day. We've talked about it a few times. We still haven't pulled it up yet, but just conspiracy theories in general. They seem to reverberate really well within the American culture. Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is just a really basic observation that I've seen is just conspiracy theories in general. They really reverberate with the amount of people involved, right? So, if it's a presidential assassination, it's huge. 9/11, huge, right? All these conspiracy theories that popped up around all of these major events, they seem to really ramp up with the more popular the conspiracy theory is. So why do you think that Americans tend to really buy into this stuff so well?
And especially with the JFK, we were actually looking up a poll before 2017. 61% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy regarding the JFK assassination. So do you?
And by the way, that number's down from about 80% when Gallup first started doing that. So the number is eroding a bit. Now you're asking me to do social psychology rather than history, but yes, I can do that. People, well, there are various theories. One is that people don't like to believe that the world is random. That is to say, they don't like to believe that something coming out of nowhere randomly can radically change history. They want something that's systematic that they can understand. And people can understand a conspiracy theory because it says, oh, there were these people with this motive. And since they had a motive, and since they would, at least supposedly, benefit from this conspiracy, they probably did it. Now, you can add to that the fact that there seems to be a collector's instinct among a lot of people. And if you're a conspiracy theorist, you like to collect pieces of conspiracy evidence. Well, Sam Holland said so and so, and Lee Bowers said so and so. And the bullet would have had to zig and zag and blah, and it's pristine and blah. So since you like to collect pieces of conspiracy evidence, you have an incentive not to question any of it too much. And as you collect it, you can end up with what looks like an impressive mass of information that supports your conspiracy theory. So it's really psychologically very appealing. I mean, there are other elements. For example, you can use it to demonize your political enemies. Okay? Conspiracy theory typically has been, most conspiracy theorists have come from the left. That is, they believe some right-wing cabal in 1963, and that fascist cabal still rules America. On the other hand, if you go over to the John Birch Society, in the wake of the assassination, they put out little stickers you could put on an envelope you mailed that said, "Communism killed Kennedy," stressing that Oswald was a communist, he'd been to the Soviet Union, blah, blah, etc. So, yeah, if you want to find connections between Oswald and communism, you certainly can. If you look carefully enough, he wasn't a very good communist anymore than he was a very good husband or a very good worker. So you can demonize your partisan enemies. You can also believe yourself to be sophisticated. You can sort of say, well, they are telling us such and such, but no, I don't believe that. I know better than that. They can't fool me. So you can believe that, well, the ordinary herd of people will accept, what the government says, what CNN says, what Fox News says, etc. But, I'm too sophisticated. So it can be a kind of produce a cheap claim to sophistication. So I think there are a lot of psychological forces that incline people to believe conspiracy theories. And sure enough, there are some conspiracies. Watergate was a conspiracy. 9/11 was a conspiracy. It just didn't involve the U.S. government. It involved a bunch of radical jihadi. So there are real conspiracies, and every so often the Justice Department will prosecute some kind of commercial conspiracy. So in general, it's not absurd to believe in conspiracies, but I think psychological dynamics make people particularly prone to believe in conspiracies because it fulfills various psychological needs.
So one of the basic ones that everybody always brings up to me is, well, Julius Caesar was stabbed by all these people, right? And that involved this huge conspiracy to, bring all these people together to stab this dude to death, right? So, there has been giant conspiracies that have worked, right? But it seems to me that, especially nowadays, it's just too impossible. There's just
Oh,
too many damn people involved in everything the government does that you're not going to be able to pull it off anymore.
yeah, the all I know about the Julius Caesar conspiracy was having read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar many years ago, but I don't think that was huge, was it? Brutus, Cassius, I mean, just a few guys. Today, I mean, for example, a moon landing conspiracy, how many people would have to be involved in that? Lots and lots. How many military contractors, would know that they didn't really build something that could go to the moon? How many people in mission control and NASA would know that these monitors in front of us aren't really showing what's really happening because it doesn't make any sense. It just looks okay on television.
Even the Soviets too, because they congratulated the U.S. And they were watching Apollo rockets go there. So even a nation that who had all the reason in the world to point out a U.S. lie, did not.
However, I will point out one thing I point out to my students. The Soviet Union might have, at least the people in the Soviet Union would know, might have an incentive to inflate the achievements of the U.S. space program.
True.
Because that would create a claim for more money for their space program.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard that before.
Right. Playing the victim is a good thing, right?
But however, in general, you're right. It's just grossly implausible. For the JFK assassination is concerned, I mean, how many people would have to be involved in the cover-up? But here's something worse. Okay, the conspiracists will say, well, the conspiracy controlled the investigation. Did they control all the FBI, all the Dallas cops, the Secret Service, even civilians who might come forward with pieces of evidence? But it's even worse, okay? They would have to know in advance that they could control anyone who might turn up with damning evidence of a conspiracy. They would not necessarily know who that would be. Confidence that whoever found an extra bullet in Dealey Plaza, it could be made to disappear. Or whoever actually saw a shooter on Grassy Knoll could be discredited. By the way, there are some people who claim to have seen a Grassy Knoll shooter, and you look at their testimony closely, they're pretty suspect. I mean, like for example, Jean Hill, who later claimed to have seen a Grassy Knoll shooter, but 45 minutes after the assassination, she was flat out asked by WBAP TV in Fort Worth, "Did you see a shooter?" She said, "No, I didn't see any shooter. I only heard." Well, could a conspiracy guarantee that they could discredit any witness like that? Or might there be a very good witness that is essentially impossible to discredit, or somebody with a camera taking a picture of the shooter? And there again, there's a image called Badge Man that supposedly is a picture of the shooter, but it's basically just a bunch of blobs of light and shadow. How would they know somebody with a high quality camera and a long focus lens wouldn't have a quite clear picture of somebody shooting?
Yeah,
so they'd have to know all that in advance.
I've looked at that Badge Man photo, the original photo, with nothing highlighted, nothing circled, nothing colored in. I've looked at the original photo and tried to zoom in and find that spot they're talking about. Even though I know it exists, or at least conspiracy theorists say it exists, and I try to zoom in, I cannot locate it until I actually cross-referenced it with their images that they've brought up.
Yeah. So, again, if you're not an idiot and you're trying to put together a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, can you control the investigation? You can't possibly be sure in advance that you could control the people you need to control. And there are better ways to kill Kennedy. Why not knock him off during one of his assignations with one of his mistresses, which would give a lot of people quite a good reason to cover up a lot of what was going on. and maybe cover ups. What are they going to say? Well, he was killed because of a conspiracy. Well, how do you know? Well, he was with his mistress. So there are much better ways to kill off a political figure you want to kill off, and have the conspiracy unknown, rather than shooting somebody right out of the middle of Dealey Plaza.
So basically, with the JFK assassination, why do you think a plurality of people believe that there was a conspiracy? Do you think just on a surface level it looks suspicious? I mean, here we go. We have this communist who defected and came back doing all this suspicious things. He shot him, and then 2 days later he gets shot and killed. Why do you think the majority of people, maybe who haven't researched it as much, believe that there was some sort of conspiracy?
Well, a lot more people have seen conspiracy videos and read conspiracy books than have seen the debunking. So they tend to accept what they've been told, including some things that just flatly aren't true. Jack Ruby wanted to go to Washington so he could spill the beans on the conspiracy. No, he wanted to go to Washington to convince Lyndon Johnson that he was innocent of any conspiracy. So a lot of them have been told things that are untrue. It is true that a lot of people, when Ruby shot Oswald, thought, well, that really looks suspicious. It really looks like Ruby was assigned to shut him up. So that particular fact, I think, convinced a lot of people that there must be something conspiratorial going on.
But that doesn't even make sense to me, though. Again, if you wanted to plan a conspiracy and Oswald was a patsy, say he was part of it, right? Like CIA, say the mainstream conspiracy theorists say. If you let him get caught, right? If you were worried about him talking, why would you just trade one person for another? Now they have Ruby, and if Ruby was in on it, then you can get him talking. Or why would you let Oswald go around in front of news camera footage when he was in the jail, allowing him to say whatever he wanted? Like he claimed, a policeman hit him. He claimed he wasn't receiving legal counsel. I mean, you'd want to take him out right away, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and he said they're taking me in because I've been to the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy. Mr. E. Howard Hunt told me to meet him in the second floor lunchroom.
Exactly, yeah.
He said, they're taking me in because I've been to the Soviet Union.
Right.
In other words, his theory of being a patsy seemed to be he'd been arrested because he was a leftist. It wasn't, I've been set up by other people, or I'm doing what I am told. So Lee Oswald was, in fact, not a conspiracy theorist, given his own statements. I think that's true. And as for Ruby, Ruby was way more talkative than Oswald.
He would be
Ruby was a compulsive.
The last person you want involved in a conspiracy, from what I've heard at least and read.
He was a compulsive talker, and he also loved to suck up to authority. And how do you know he's not going to suck up to the authority of the Dallas cops or the FBI who were interrogating him? He actually was pretty much in thrall of authority and liked to suck up to authority. So no, he would be a very, very bad person to have in custody.
So you brought up Ruby's testimony a little bit, and we talked about this before we started, but I find this really fascinating. So a little bit of background. Maybe when I was in my late teens or early 20s, I was like most people. I thought there was some form of conspiracy. I really had not read into much of it. Once I started looking into it more, I changed to the other side. But I remember watching JFK, the Oliver Stone movie JFK, and thinking, how could anyone not believe there was a conspiracy? And then, like the thing when they recreated the scene when Ruby was giving his testimony to the Warren Commission, and Ruby is sitting there and he's saying, I cannot tell the truth here. I want to tell you the truth, but I cannot tell you it here in Dallas. They're going to kill me. Or he didn't say. He said, I will not be alive to talk to you another time. I need to get out of here. But they cut it off right there. They just cut it off. Where in a lot of conspiracy theorists, they bring up this point, but they always cut it off there. Ruby goes on and all the conspiracy theorists know perfectly well that he is not right there saying he's part of a conspiracy. In fact, the exact opposite. The exact opposite. And these people purposely leave that out. He explains in there very clearly. He says that there are right-wing groups, and he named them specifically. He said that the John Birch Society, right? And he said that they're trying to make it out as if he is part of a conspiracy, that he is part of a communist conspiracy. It wasn't that he was trying to admit he was. It was the exact opposite. And then also, the point when he's saying that he won't be alive to talk to him another time. Well, you have to understand the background of it. He had just been found guilty of the murder of Oswald, and he was in Texas, which is, he was facing the death penalty, and that's what he was referring to, that he was going to be given the death penalty and he wouldn't be around to talk to people later, which he did receive the death penalty, right?
Yeah, exactly, because of the incompetence of his lawyer. He should have gotten murder without malice, but Melvin Belli, who was really a tort lawyer, flew into Dallas wanting the publicity and represented him and really blundered the case very badly. He should have been convicted of murder without malice, that is, murder that's not premeditated. There was another thing, though. He was convinced that there was a new Holocaust being mounted against the Jews.
Oh, that's right.
JFK quotes him as saying, the most terrible thing will happen. And then it cuts out what he thinks will happen. He thinks the mass slaughter of Jews is what will happen. Actually, when he was being held before a second trial, remember his first conviction was overturned, he was in the Dallas County Jail, which, by the way, is catty-cornered right across the street from the depository. He would sort of put his ear to the wall and believe he heard Jews being tortured on the floors below. And his guards would say, all right, cut it out, Jack, or we're not going to play cards with you anymore. They didn't like being bugged by his paranoid fantasies, but he was clearly far gone into paranoia. He actually asked when Arlen Specter was one of the staff who came along, is he Jewish? And he was told, yeah, he was. He felt some.
Oh, did we lose you? Oh.
Believe that there was a new, Ruby really believed that there was a new Holocaust being mounted.
Wow. So that was really the turning point for me. So I watched the Oliver Stone movie. I saw that and I'm like, I can't believe anyone would not think there's a conspiracy. Look at, here's Ruby admitting it right here. And how can anyone not believe that? Until, I looked it up. I read the whole transcript of his testimony, which is really fascinating if you have the time. It's a long one, but it's very fascinating to read and get a glimpse into his state of mind. But then
it's long.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Let me interrupt you. It's long because he's a compulsive talker.
Oh yeah.
He seemed to believe the more he could talk, the more he could vindicate his position. So, and then when he was finally given a so-called lie detector test, there really isn't such a thing as a real lie detector.
That was
it's
an
not
interesting read too. I read that.
Yeah, it's not admissible in court, but he kept on and on and on, and basically it was sort of useless because he just kept at it too long. It violated all the protocols, but he didn't want to shut up.
Mm-hmm. So once I read that, I read the transcript and figured out, no, it's the exact opposite. And at least these people, the JFK film, other conspiracy theorists that bring this point up, I couldn't believe, how they purposely mislead people like this. And that really started making me look up other claims. And that's eventually how I came across your website. I think the really valuable thing about your website is you don't just present the case. You will actually go in and address pretty much every conspiracy theorist claim out there, which is very valuable. Again, that's how I found it, because I was looking up some obscure fact about it that I heard from a conspiracy theorist and found your website, and you explain in detail, like, that's not quite how it happened. This happened. You have to keep in mind, this person's been dishonest in the past, or their story slowly changed, as is the case with a few of the people, different witnesses. And Eric has it pulled up here. But so the other thing I've noticed too is when you try to debate or talk with conspiracy theorists, it's almost impossible. So how would you go about debating people or trying to change their mind? Or is it just impossible? Because I've noticed, I've talked to different people, anything I bring up. So, for example, one guy told me there was 15 shots. And I said, 15 shots. I said, do you have a problem with the hundreds or so people who none of them claimed there were 15 shots? And the vast, vast majority said 3 or 4 or even 3. And he said, oh, they're all liars. They all lied. The government got to all of them. And I said, well, even Gene Hill. And then he got upset, and it didn't go good from there. But no matter what facts you bring up, they just say they're lies. You can't debate somebody when they just say everything you try to bring up is a lie, a government lie.
Let me suggest that if government was as competent as conspiracy theorists believed, and they ever set out to do something good, like end poverty, gosh, they could do it in no time flat if they were that competent. I mean, that kind of competence just doesn't correspond to the government we know and probably don't particularly love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the DMV would be extremely efficient, right? You can get right in and out of there in minutes.
Exactly.
Or things like Watergate. I mean, it was a relatively minor thing what Nixon did. I mean, it was bad, right? I'm not saying it wasn't bad.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But it was relatively minor compared to assassinating a sitting president and covering the whole thing up. And he couldn't even get away with that.
Yeah, they screwed it up by putting a piece of tape on the door to hold it open that the guard noticed, and then poof, it's all blown to hell. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we can go through a few more of the basic claims. One thing real quick, actually, I was interested in is what happened to the first bullet. So there are 3 bullets that Oswald fired. First one missed is what they believe. Second one is the one that hit Kennedy in the upper back, came out through his throat, and then hit Connally. And the third shot, the famous headshot, which killed him. So do we know what happened with the first shot?
I think we can make a pretty good guess. There's several witnesses that claim to see particles of something or dust or something kick up early on, maybe a little bit before Zapruder frame 160. We see John Connally, and I think it's like 163, 4, 5, sharply, very, very sharply whip his head around to the right. Some people think they can see a reaction from Kennedy. I'm not sure. Maybe so, maybe not. So I would say that's sort of fair evidence of an early shot, maybe at 155, 160. That early, you could avoid. You wouldn't have the live oak in your way. So I'd say. And there's sort of moderate evidence of something like that. I don't want to say that's extremely strong. Not nearly as strong as shot at 223. When if you look at Kennedy's reaction, his arms flying up to his neck. That corresponds pretty closely to what is known about neuromuscular reactions and how quickly they happen. That is consistent with a shot at 223. And then Connally does several things very shortly thereafter.
He jumps. I noticed he jumps. He kind of
you get a hunching reaction. His lapel flaps, which might or might not be significant. It's the bullet didn't go through the lapel; it went through his coat a few inches actually below the lapel. Then his hat flips up, which it might do if the bullet has hit him in the wrist and either bounced up or maybe the radioperiosteal reflex. So a bunch of things happened to Connally shortly after 223. So I'd say there's pretty good evidence of a single bullet. It's a Zapruder frame 223, and sort of fair evidence of a bullet as early as 160, 155.
Now, just for anyone who doesn't know, these are a reference to the particular frame numbers.
Zapruder frames,
they broke it down to make it easier to describe. And
I lapsed into buff talk. We just give numbers and everybody knows. Oh, it's a Zapruder frame. Um, but no bullet has been no
Nothing has been recovered from
bullet
the
or
first shot.
no bullet or known fragments from the early shot, if it occurred that early, have been found.
And then there was it James Tate? He
Take
was
yeah.
a bystander who received some sort of wound, right? Or he was grazed by something, and then this is something
Yeah.
conspiracy theorists point to.
Yeah, there's no doubt he was hit by a fragment of some sort. I actually tend to agree with a conspiracist named Josiah Thompson, who said it was probably a fragment from the headshot. It would have to travel quite a way down Dealey Plaza, but there is some fragments probably exited Kennedy's head at a fairly high velocity, because there is a ding, a fairly deep ding in the chrome topping of the windshield. Now, another piece of old geezer stuff. Okay, cars used to have chrome on steel, and it was fairly substantial steel. All right.
Right. Yeah.
Which means if it had enough velocity to leave a fair size depression in that chrome topping, maybe another fragment had the velocity to travel down Dealey Plaza to really right near the triple underpass and hit Tague, on the cheek. That's just a supposition, and I don't think anybody knows. Given that 90% plus of the witnesses heard 3 or fewer shots, I'm inclined to favor any scenario that has 3 shots rather than one that involves 4 or 5 or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned real quick about Connally, Governor Connally, who was sitting directly in front of Kennedy. That reminded me of something from the Oliver Stone movie, where Jim Garrison's character, or I can't think of the actor's name who played Jim Garrison, I should say. He said that the Warren Commission said he was shot at 223 or 224, as you were talking about, but he is visibly holding his lapel, his stencil. And then Garrison's character says in there that would be something physically impossible to do if he was hit in the wrist.
Yeah, well, in the first place, a couple of things. Sensory nerve, not a motor nerve. Nellie Connolly said that John Connally held his hat all the way to the hospital. In fact, she thought it probably saved his life, because he had the hat in his hand and he held it over his chest and closed up it was a sucking wound in the chest. I don't think it saved his life, but she said he had it there all the way to the hospital. They're kind of gory cases of people injured very badly, who still hold on to something. I think it was Senator Inoue of Hawaii who was in World War II and wrote his memoirs, and he was hit in the arm by a grenade. A grenade. I think it was a grenade fired by I don't think they had RPGs then, but a grenade fired from a gun or something like that, and it completely shattered his arm, and his hand was held there by some tendons or something.
Oh man!
But it still held the grenade he was intending to throw at the German.
Wow.
So there's no there's no particular reason that getting shot in the wrist is necessarily going to loosen your grip. I suppose it probably could if you're hit in a certain way, but if you're hit in another way,
right, it could
not
just
necessarily
come down to millimeter difference. Yeah.
And it broke his radius bone. But by the way, his radius bone is broken, but it's not broken as severely as it would have been if he'd been hit in the wrist by a bullet that didn't hit anything else. It was pretty clearly a bullet that had been slowed down the ballistics experts say that if a bullet, let's say fired from a Manic Arcano at full muzzle velocity, slows down in the air, so maybe 1,900 feet per second or something, hit him in the wrist, it would have completely shattered it, and the hand would have had to have been amputated. As it was the bones were put back in place and it healed.
Wow.
So what is your overall impression of the Oliver Stone's movie? I actually like the movie. It's a good fiction movie, and it's just that it's fiction, right? You have to keep that in mind while you're watching it. I enjoy the movie. I like a good conspiracy theory, but at the end of the day, you got to get out of Fantasyland. At least that's my opinion on it.
Yeah.
You can count. You can pretty much run out of numbers counting how many things are just factually wrong in that movie, right?
Yeah. There's a guy named Dave Reitzes has a web page of like 100 things wrong with the movie JFK. I have my students watch it early on in my JFK course. I don't use class time. I have them watching it in the evening. They do not complain about watching it in the evening, even though it's a 3-hour movie. I explained to them, it's a pretty good movie. It's not a documentary. The stuff might or might not be true. I show it to them because I want to get them kind of immersed in assassination lore.
Good.
That is to say, okay, this is the conspiracy view of the assassination. This is all the things conspiracy people say. So they're sort of like know a little bit about what the landscape is and what people are saying, and they don't complain. They don't complain a little bit about having to come in the evening and watch it for 3 hours.
So one of the claims in the movie, and again, conspiracy theorists bring this up all the time, is the fact that these records were sealed for 75 years after the Warren Commission finished their report. Now, this has always been a claim that they've brought up. One thing I learned recently, they say it's suspicious, right? It was suspicious that they sealed these records so nobody can see them for 75 years. One thing I actually learned recently, and forgive me, I didn't write down the actual name of the act or the law, but that was actually a law in place at the time. It was established in law back in the 30s or the 40s. I mean, well before Kennedy was president. That any federal investigation undertaken by the executive branch would have their records sealed for 75 years to protect the innocent people who were just, victim of circumstance and things like that.
Hello, you there?
Yep.
Yeah,
Did we lose you?
Okay. That's true. It's also the case that in the 1990s, because of the movie JFK, there was a lot of pressure in records, release the documents. And sure enough, there was an Assassination Records Review Board consisting of historians and archivists. Remember, archivists are a variety of librarians. They're the people who keep records and keep them safe and so forth. And they looked over everything that the government had and released most of it. Some things they agreed to go ahead and remain secret. And there are reasons you might want something secret. Maybe somebody was a government informant and they were promised secrecy. In the 1990s, I suppose it was conceivable that somebody might retaliate against somebody if their name was known. I don't think it was terribly likely in the 90s. I think it's virtually impossible today. But in theory, releasing intelligence documents might give away sources and methods.
Right, that's always the main.
Although sources and methods in 1963 are probably a lot different from sources and methods today, but there was a small number of them they agreed to continue could remain secret. And since we've had, Trump, I think it was last year, released some, but not all of the remaining ones. It's important to understand that most of the, pretty much everything, nothing that was released actually had the smoking gun about a conspiracy.
No,
there were various documents.
It's always in those last few documents, right? That's what they always claim.
Yeah. There were some things the conspiracy said, aha, this really shows that the CIA had an interest in Oswald that they didn't actually confess and blah, blah. So you can get somewhat tendentious interpretations from the documents released in the 90s and even the ones released since. But there's no actual hard evidence. And the people who've looked at them, who include members of the Assassination Records Review Board and staff of the National Archives, have been flatly saying there's no smoking gun there.
Do you think there is any more evidence to come out that's going to shed light one way or another? Or do you think at this point, what has it been, 57 years later, everything we know is pretty much out there? Any more big bombshells?
Okay, never say never, but I think it's exceedingly, unlikely anything of significance is going to come out. I mean, when Trump released a bunch of documents he released, there was, pretty much nothing there. Well, for example, one of the documents had somebody calling the Cambridge, England News. Well, it was just called the Cambridge News, but it was the Cambridge News in England, a little, I think shortly after the assassination, or maybe before, I think it was before the assassination, and said, call the American embassy, there'll be some big news. Whoa, does that mean somebody knew the assassination was going to happen? But then you ask, but wait a minute, why would they call a paper in England? I mean, if they really wanted to abort it, call the Secret Service. And if you call a paper in England, why call a obscure paper in Cambridge, England, when you probably know about the Guardian, you probably know about the Telegraph, you probably know about the Times of London. So what would the point be anyway? And by the way, what would the American embassy know that the media weren't reporting? That's one of the interesting things about the assassination, whether it's Castro in Cuba or people at the White House in the U.S., they were just watching the media. They didn't have any inside knowledge. I mean, Castro was listening to Miami area AM radio stations to find out what was happening. And then some people interviewed old timers at the Cambridge News, and they didn't remember that. Okay? Well, that was about the caliber of stuff that came out in the last release. So the odds that there's anything earth-shaking in the few documents that are left is pretty far-fetched. If any new witness testimony would come out, that would be, well, to be frank, it would be kind of suspect, because we'd be asking, why didn't someone speak up sooner, contaminated, or, have they finally decided to start telling an interesting story to get attention? So I think the odds of anything of any real significance coming out are really slight.
And even the one you brought up there, somebody's saying there's going to be something in the American news that'll be big. It's also, what is the significance of that? I'm sure, like, maybe if you just pause time right now and you were to dig into all the different things people are saying around the world, you might find something that in retrospect might sound like it's significant, but, maybe things like that happen all the time.
Yeah. I don't know. All I know is, I can't figure out what the point would be. A paper in Cambridge, England, a paper pretty much nobody in the U.S. ever heard of. What's the American embassy going to know that wouldn't be broadcast on ABC, CBS, and NBC? It sort of doesn't make any sense.
So one of the ones conspiracy theorists love to bring up the most is all the suspicious murders, right? They have a list of 100 people who died under what they claim is mostly suspicious circumstances within a few years, or even in some cases I've seen a few decades after the JFK assassination. So what do you make of this?
Well, obviously I sort of think it's nonsense. In a lot of cases, it's not clear. In fact, it's even unlikely they knew anything suspicious. For example, the steward on Air Force One is on the most commonly seen list, which is from Jim Mars. The steward of Air Force One is on there. Well, what did he know? Well, since he died, maybe that means he knew something. Right? You understand the circular logic there.
Yep.
The mayor of New Orleans is on the list. Well, what is that? Well, Lee Oswald lived in New Orleans. Yeah, so did a lot of other people. There's no record of ever having met the mayor of New Orleans or
And
talked to the mayor
a
of
lot
New Orleans.
of mafia figures too. There's mafia figures on there that
Sure.
anytime one of them died within the years after. And that's another thing. I can't remember if it was your site or another one. If it was David, is it Reitz? Reitz's?
I think it's Reach's, yeah.
I can't remember which one of you guys brought it up, but I mean, a lot of the people on the list lived relatively high risk lifestyles. I mean, you have police officers on there, you have people of the mafia, you have strippers and prostitutes, and these people are more likely than the average person, I think, to die in what could be maybe a suspicious way or a murder or accidental.
Yeah, and you also, if you actually look into a lot of the deaths, you find it was essentially natural causes. I mean, like Dorothea Kilgallen's on all the list. Okay, well, she died in bed. There was an autopsy. It said no signs of violence. She was in a room in a townhouse with her husband and sleeping in another room. She came in very late because she was on the TV show What's My Line, and a son sleeping in another room. No sign of a break-in, but the toxicology showed a moderately elevated level of alcohol and a moderately elevated level of barbiturates. And as I hope most people these days know, you mix our alcohol and barbiturates, that's really bad news. Because the level of alcohol by itself or a level of barbiturates by themselves that are benign, it can be deadly if you combine them. But that's what the toxicology said when it came back. That's the science. And if you go into detail about a lot of these, you find it looks like sort of a kind of ordinary death. There's no reason at all to think some cleanup squad. It's also the case that it's not clear Dorothy Kilgallen actually knew anything that wasn't essentially fed to her by Mark Lane. She published conspiratorial stuff in her column, but it was stuff that had just leaked out, for example, from Warren Commission testimony. She said she was going to break the case. She was obsessed with the case, but she didn't claim she had broken the case. So there's really no evidence. And some of the there's a guy named Richard Belzer who wrote a book called Hit List. Like, he has country singer Jim Reeves on the list. Well, why? Because Jim Reeves was telling people he thought there might be a conspiracy in the JFK assassination. I mean, how many people were telling somebody they thought there might be a conspiracy? And he died in a plane crash, which brings up the interesting question: why isn't Otis Redding on the list, or Ronnie Van Zant? You probably know about Ronnie Van Zant, maybe not Otis Redding.
I don't know. I don't recognize either of those names, actually.
Ronnie Van Zant's Leonard Skinner, Otis Redding, soul singer of the 60s. I say I'm playing my geezer card again. Right? I'm playing my geezer card again. But those are other famous entertainers that died in a plane crash. So if you're going to include Jim Reeves, why not some other entertainers that died in a plane crash?
Yeah, throw them.
So
anyone who died after November 23rd, 1963, throw them all on there. All several billion people who died.
Yeah, and even if they insisted that there was a conspiracy, that there was no conspiracy and that Oswald did it, you could say they were lying, but they were about to open up and explain the truth.
Like Lee Bowers, right? That's one I've read where they said he was searching for the truth, but there's no evidence of that, right? And then he died.
No. He's doing his job in a auto crash, and no evidence he was forced off the road or anything like that.
And then also you have to ask why some more prominent figures were not killed then. For example, Mark Lane. All right, Mark Lane was a real vocal person. He had his testimony in the Warren Commission. People like Gene Hill, who said there was a conspiracy. She said she saw another shooter, and her story gradually changed over time. But people like that who lived until died of old age for the most part, I believe.
Oh yeah, Jane Hill died. I forget the date. Shortly after 2000, after telling her all the conspiratorial stuff since the mid 1980s. Mark Lane, I think, just died about a year ago. Yeah, he lived to a ripe old age. The question is, why can't the conspirators kill the right people?
So that brings up a good. I was talking to some people at the Elite Plaza, two authors. I mentioned their names to you before we started, but Marshall Evans, he was an author, trying to sell his book, and I talked to him a little bit. And there was another guy, Robert Corden. He was interesting. He got up. We talked a little bit, but I asked him. I actually brought up your name. I said, what do you think of John McAdams? And he said, you're a CIA, you're a government stooge, you're a liar, you're paid by the government. So maybe if you want to address that right now, are you a member of the CIA?
No. Well, actually, yeah, but my check from Langley is about 30 years late, so that I keep wondering. Well, wait a minute, where is it? Was it lost in the mail? Why did I have that?
So I also asked him. I said, "Is there any?" So they obviously believe there is a conspiracy. I asked him. I said, "Is there anyone, any author or any researcher or anyone that you respect who does not think there's a conspiracy?" And this Robert Corden said, "No, they're all liars. Every one of them is a liar." So I'm interested to hear what you think. Is there anyone who does believe there is a conspiracy that you respect? Do you think they are honest, maybe just misguided, or anything like that?
Well, first of all, I'm inclined to think that I think even the more extreme ones may be honest. They're just sort of fanatics. But sure. Josiah Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, is a pretty honest book, I think. I don't find him distorting anything. Now, his Dealey Plaza shooting scenario, where he believed the shots came from, I think is merely mistaken. All right, but I don't think I don't think he's dishonest. Let me think. Who else can I think? I would have to have my shelf of JFK assassination books in front of me.
How many books do you have? How big is that shelf?
I guess 100, maybe something like that. Nice. And I don't have a huge. Yeah. But I mean, Thompson comes to mind. I think Jeff Morley is probably honest about most things. Who else? I'd have to think a bit and look at my list of books. But there are some. I don't think that. I think Peter Dale Scott's perfectly honest. I think he's just too enthusiastic about finding connections between everybody and everybody else, and his so-called deep politics. So if I thought more, I could come up with I think John Newman is honest. Again, I think he draws all kinds of unwarranted inferences, but I don't think he's dishonest. I don't see any evidence of him ever intentionally concealing something. Even if I find him overlooking evidence, he ought to take seriously. I don't think so. So if I just sat here and thought a long time, I could probably think of several more. But
is there any evidence?
But you don't want dead air while I'm thinking, so go ahead.
No, that's good to know that there's actually people that you do respect on the other side.
Definitely.
Obviously you can be forgiven for not memorizing every last person's name, but like I said, compared to this person I talked to, just flat out, nope, they're all liars.
And so that was one of the questions I wanted to kind of ask you was, out of all these people, I'm sure there's some you respect. Have they come up with any evidence that you still kind of go, ooh, I still don't really know about that. That still could be a thing,
Yeah, that's a good point. Good question.
Uh,
Something you
Good
still ponder
question.
about every night, like something that you just can't sleep. You just can't sleep because this thing.
Well,
You're just
no,
curious.
I have no trouble sleeping over any of this thing. The one thing I have never been able to decisively debunk, and I can't attribute this to any particular. I don't think any conspiracy authors particularly made this point, is that a clear majority of the witnesses in Dealey Plaza who testified to what the shot sequence was thought there was a shot, then another shot, then quickly a third shot, that the last two shots were close together, while the first two were not. But the shooting sequence I've just told you about, that's widely accepted among lone assassin people, would have, let's see, from 155 to 223, and then 313, would not have the last two shots bunched. Would probably have the shots, almost equally, or maybe even a little bunching, but for the first two. And I'm not sure I can explain that. Now, I can come up with possibilities, such as when people catch on that something is happening, that it's not just a backfire or firecracker, their perceptions change.
Absolutely.
Or their time perceptions get distorted.
Yeah, I can testify to that myself. I was actually staying in a place one time at a friend's house, and there was a shooting nearby that night. And I can't, for the life of me, I very vividly remember hearing the sound of the gunshots, but I could not tell you exactly how many shots were. There were somewhere between 5 to 8, and also the pacing of it. I mean, it's something that happens so quick. I think the human mind is not a tape recorder, to go back and play it perfectly.
Yeah. Well, that comes to my mind as something that I can't decisively debunk. I can come up with, maybe the time perceptions were distorted. For example, I actually don't know of any good scholarly study of time perceptions under stress. Maybe it's out there. If so, I haven't found it.
Mm-hmm. So, let's say tomorrow some bombshell evidence comes out and it says there was a conspiracy. Which conspiracy theory would you be least surprised by, or in another way, which one do you find most plausible? I've heard you say, and I really respect this in interviews, that you're not saying 100% sure there was no conspiracy. You're just saying all the evidence points to there not being a conspiracy, that it was Oswald alone. But of course, you're not going to ignore the possibility of it. Which one do you think you'd be least surprised by?
Well, the more massive the conspiracy, the more surprised I would be. First of all, a conspiracy involving Oswald, I'd say, is pretty much necessary. A conspiracy involving Oswald as a witting participant, rather than a patsy, would be the most plausible. If he were pacified, he'd have every incentive to tell people, I was told to meet Mr. E. Howard Hunt on the second floor lunchroom,
Mm-hmm.
But if he was conspiring with someone whose agenda he knew and agreed with, that would make sense. To give you an example, one good theory about his motivation, and it's only a theory, but it's a good one, comes from Gene Davison, who points out that Oswald may well have known about Kennedy assassination plots against Castro's life. If he did not know about the assassination plots, which he could have, because Castro, in an interview with the Associated Press, clearly alluded to the fact that the U.S. was trying to assassinate him. And that interview was printed in the New Orleans papers while Oswald was there. No one can prove whether Oswald saw it or not. But he would have certainly known that the Kennedy administration was hostile to Castro. That was in the Militant. That was in the Worker. Those were two communist papers he was reading. So a conspiracy involving Oswald and another leftist or two or three leftists, again, the fewer the better,
Right.
For our theory, conspiring to kill Kennedy would be would be, let's say, not implausible. Gene Davison's theory is that Oswald was the self-appointed protector of the Cuban Revolution, that he killed Kennedy as the self-appointed protector of the Castro Revolution, which he was very enamored of. Well, if that makes sense for one person, Oswald, it would make sense for two or three very like-minded people. But for that to make sense, it makes the most sense that Oswald was the shooter. He was well positioned to be the shooter, but maybe somebody put him up to it, or maybe somebody was supposed to help him escape, and that fell through. So those are conspiracy theories that are, shall we say, not wildly implausible.
Yeah, that's actually what I kind of think too. I think if there was one, again, you'd have to go as small as possible, or smaller the better, just because it lessens the chance of anyone. I mean, the fact that no one has been able to come up with any conclusive evidence showing that he was, you'd have to kind of go small. It's the only way you can keep a secret this big, that quiet. And I think, yeah, I agree. I think it would be kind of in favor of the whole Cuban revolution in Castro, just because of different circumstantial evidence or different things that were going on. He was real active in New Orleans, obviously, with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And even right before that, the one testimony I find interesting, maybe I can ask your opinion on it, was Carlos Bruinger. So Carlos reported he was a Cuban refugee, anti-Castro, living in New Orleans, and he testified that he had received information that some pro-Castro agent, because I guess one got caught, a pro-Castro agent was going to be coming to try to infiltrate his group. Was it the DRE?
Yeah, DRE.
Yeah, to infiltrate his group and within the next 3 days. And then sure enough, Oswald walked into his store, and that was within a 3-day period. I can't remember the exact time. I think it was 2 days later or something like that. So I could find, maybe, and then not only that, but one of the incidences that fascinates me the most in terms of a conspiracy is the Sylvia Odio incident. That one really fascinates me for several reasons, because the timing just matches up nearly perfectly. So she doesn't know the exact date, but she said it was the end of September, because she was packing up and getting ready to move out of her apartment. She had to be out by October 1st. So she knew it was the end of September. And she claimed 3 people came to the door. One of them was Oswald. 2 other ones were either Cuban or Mexican. And they were trying to pretend like they were part of, and she was suspicious of them. But they were coming, asking for money for their cause against Castro. Again, she had suspicions. And the timing just almost matches up perfectly, because there's a few-day gap where we don't know exactly where Oswald was in between New Orleans and when he went to Mexico City. And it almost matches up perfectly there. What do you make of the Sylvia Odio incident?
Okay, let's about the infiltration thing. Oswald wrote something called a revolutionary resume to give to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, where he outlined his credentials as a bona fide important left-winger. One thing he mentioned there was he said he had infiltrated the anti-Castro forces in New Orleans and used the information he gained against them. So his interpretation of the visit to the Casa Roca run by Carlos Bruinger was, yes, he was infiltrating the gusanos, he called them the worms. As for the Odio thing, it's important to remember that there certainly was an Anglo type visiting with a few Cubans, and a guy named Leopoldo called Odio, I think it was the day after, and said, this Anglo is loco. I think he said he's a Marine and a good shot, if memory serves. And then he said, we should have killed Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Odio, in her own testimony, says when she heard Kennedy was shot, she thought, Leon did it. Leon did it. She remembered the name of the Anglo visitor as Leon Oswald. She thought, Leon did it. Leon did it. And then she blacked out and was taken to the hospital. And then in the evening, I think it was at 7 or 8 o'clock, she woke up in the hospital and saw a picture of Oswald on TV and said, yes, that's Leon. Leon did it. Now, it's important to remember there's a very, very large element of suggestion there. Believing that the Anglo visitor had shot Kennedy before she saw a picture of him. And then she sees a picture of Oswald and she thinks, yes, that's him. That's a very large element of suggestibility. It's also the case that a lot of pretty good evidence puts Oswald in Houston on the evening of the 25th. That would be the evening it would have to be. Mm-hmm. By the way, Odio thought it was Thursday or Friday. The 25th is Wednesday. But, you can posit she was mistaken about that.
Right. If you move it to like Tuesday or something, because Oswald's wife left on the 23rd, right? And then we don't know exactly where he was. He said he was going to stay one more day to pick up unemployment check, but we don't know.
He did that. We know he did that.
He did do
that.
Okay.
He did do that, although you could posit that on the evening before, if somebody gave him a ride, he could have, it would have been from New Orleans all the way to Dallas at that point, gave him all the way a ride all the way to the Odios and all the way back. That would work. On the evening of the 25th, there's good evidence tying him to a phone call to a woman named Estelle Twyford. The evidence is written evidence. First, she had a note that said Lee Harvey Oswald. I think it had a phone number and then Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which she produced. But then she had an envelope sent to the Socialist Labor Party. That was another lefty faction, not as far to the left as the communist or the Trotskyist. The Socialist Labor Party asking for literature that had been forwarded to her husband, who was the Texas chair of the Socialist Labor Party in Texas. And she actually had, Horace Twyford, her husband, who arrived back the next day, he had been at sea, he was a merchant seaman, actually had that envelope. And further, the Twyford's phone number was in Lee Harvey Oswald's address book. So I think you pretty much put a trip to Dallas the night before, where you're right, Marina, but someone have had to take him to Dallas and bring him back on that evening, probably not to contradict the Twyford evidence, which is handwritten evidence and it's pretty solid.
I never heard of that one. Estelle Twyford? Estelle
Twyford, Twiford.
Interesting. That's another thing I'm going to be reading into tonight. I had not heard of that one. But I just from what I understood, it was the 23rd that she left. He might have picked up the welfare check the next day. For me, it kind of matched up maybe, and again, like I said, I don't necessarily believe there's a conspiracy, but if there was one, I thought this was a really good point, just because maybe he left on the 24th instead, left New Orleans, went back to Dallas. He could have been around with different people, and then went to Houston to go to Mexico City from there.
Yeah.
But you're saying there is other evidence that
it's pretty clear he picked up the unemployment check on the morning of the 25th, because the FBI actually talked to the U.S. Post Office people and followed the check by truck. I think it was from Dallas to Houston, where it was on a train. There wasn't Amtrak then. What would it? I forget. Would it have been Santa Fe or something? Mm-hmm. And the train made it to New Orleans. They figured out when the train made it to New Orleans and what's the earliest the check could have gotten to the Lafayette Street Post Office in New Orleans, and it was, I think, 5:30 a.m. on the morning of the 25th. So they actually followed that check. They actually asked, was mail ever airlifted? And postal people said, no. I assume they meant not unless they paid for or airmail. There used to be something called airmail,
Mhm.
but even then, I doubt they airmailed it from Houston, from Dallas um, to New Orleans. So it would have been the morning of the 25th when it would have had to have been picked up.
Interesting. Is that in the? I'm sorry, I should know this, but is that in the Warren Commission?
No.
Her testimony? Where was her testimony in? Or
Oh,
was
oh,
it
you
just
mean
given
you
outside
mean
of it?
Sylvia Odio's testimony?
Oh
Odio's
no,
testimony.
yeah, I read
Uh,
her testimony.
yeah, that
The
was in the
Illinois,
Warren Commission. Yeah,
the
that's the
Twice
Warren
Ward.
Commission. Yeah.
Oh, all right. I'll have to. Um. So
You'll also find it on my webpage on Odio. So
yeah,
yeah.
actually, Eric just pulled it up here. He has the affidavit. Perfect.
Yeah.
Um. So when I've been reading, I haven't read the whole thing. I've read a lot of it, and I've probably read at least 100 or 150 testimonies from the Warren Commission, the transcripts. Um, what I'm fascinated by is a lot of people criticize the Warren Commission for saying it was rushed, it was not enough, different things like that. But when I read through it, I'm fascinated by how much work they actually put into this. So do you think, are there valid criticisms of the Warren Commission? Did they kind of gloss over certain things? Do you think that they shouldn't have?
Uh, a guy named Philip Sheenan wrote a book called Cruel and Shocking Act, which is sort of an inside view of the Warren Commission. And sure, there are legitimate criticisms. It was, in a sense, it was rushed. They thought they're going to be through by April or something, and they only got through by September, working their butts off. LBJ wanted it done before the fall because they didn't want it to become involved in the election. But you're correct, it's just a massive amount of work. If you had to point to one error I think they made, it was not to look at the autopsy photos and x-rays and have them examined by well-qualified forensic pathologists. Where Kennedy's wounds were concerned, they simply took the word of the pathologist who autopsied Kennedy, who were ordinary hospital pathologists. They were not forensic pathologists. That is to say, they weren't doing the kind of autopsy you need in any legal case. A murder case, a coroner's jury trying to find out if a death is suicide or accident or murder or what. And no, they weren't qualified to do that. But the Warren Commission just depended on their testimony. Now, the reason for this was deference, particularly on the part of Earl Warren himself, to the Kennedy family and the sensibilities of the Kennedy family. There's also a passage in the deliberations of the commission early on where they basically decided that everything and sure enough, there are 26 volumes where it was published. But they believed if they looked at the autopsy photos and x-rays, they'd have to publish those too, which are, well, they're gory. They're...
Oh yeah.
Remember in 1963, 64, you didn't show movies with people getting their brains blown out.
No.
You still can't. We keep getting demonetized on YouTube for stuff like that. You still can't.
But
you
even
can,
more,
they've been... there have been movies in theaters that have gotten away with that, but I think that was the main failing, is Earl Warren's personal tendency to defer to the sensibilities of the Kennedy family. And you can sort of see that, okay? They were collectively the victims. They'd had their brother, husband, president, etc., husband, brother, president, assassinated. So, it wasn't inhumane to be sympathetic with him, but he should have been more hard-nosed.
Right. One question I have not looked into enough, and I'm curious about, is another claim conspiracy theorists have brought up is Oswald's job at a photocopying job he had. And I don't know enough about this. I haven't looked into it much. Wonder if I can get your intake on it. But they were saying that he was working with a company who was doing classified work for the government. Is that part true? Or what was that?
Yeah, Jaggers Child Stovall in
Was it Fort Worth?
Dallas.
Or Dallas? Okay.
No, it was in Dallas. Yeah. The thing about that, yeah, they did do classified work. Now, Richard Stovall, who testified before the Warren Commission, said Oswald wasn't working in that part of the company. Was he telling the truth? I don't know. But I know what they were doing. They were producing maps, okay, which might include stuff like, I don't know where military installations were in Cuba or something. I don't know exactly what that was. That is true as far as it goes. Now, is it sinister? Well, I mean, Jagger Stovall was not contracted to spy on some other country. They weren't I don't know, an electronics firm, building encoding machines or something like that. They were just reproducing maps. So if he had access to any classified material, it's unlikely it had anything. It was just Jagger Stovall being sloppy about whom they let see the material. And if they were, it's probably the case that the CIA would have disapproved about that and been very unhappy about it. So no, that doesn't make him a CIA agent or operative or asset. At worst, it makes him somebody who might have had access to material he wasn't supposed to, at worst. And if Richard Stovall was telling the truth, even that's not the case.
And then another one I've always kind of been curious on is Oswald practicing with the rifle. So you obviously, when you shoot a rifle, you have to sight it in. You have to do different things. You have to practice with it to be a good shot. And there's no evidence, or is there, that Oswald has fired a weapon since the Soviet Union, or even a rifle since his time in the Marines, which was 3-4 years earlier. So what would your response to was there any times he was practicing, or?
Well, number one, there's one witness. I think it was Jean DeMorenschil talked about. I think Marina told her Oswald had been out somewhere shooting at leaves or something. I don't know exactly what that means or how, whether it was any serious target practice. I do know the FBI went out to the Trinity River bottom, where there was a kind of a dike or levee, and people would shoot there because you could simply fire into the levee and it was safe. They didn't find any evidence there that Oswald had fired. So I simply don't know. As for sighting in the scope, Oswald was pretty good in the Marines with iron sights. So the shots he made in Dealey Plaza wouldn't be that difficult with iron sights. The headshot was that'd be a long way from me, but I'm not a gun buff. And Oswald was he was a sharpshooter in the Marines, which might not be as great as it sounds, because you know Chris Kyle was an expert and among the top experts in the Marines.
And that's one level above sharpshooter, right? There's
that's one level above sharpshooter. So if you're a sharpshooter, you're kind of an average Marine. However, the average Marine is way better than the guys in Wisconsin who go up north in late November to shoot deer, right? I mean, the average Marine's quite good by civilian standards. I think the best evidence he could shoot Kennedy was that. There's a lot of other evidence he did. But as far as first of all, we don't know he didn't practice.
Right.
Number two, we have only somewhat indirect evidence that he did. But we do have evidence that he was, from the Marines, he was pretty good with iron sights.
And there were a few Warren Commission testimonies from different people at a shooting range, which conspiracy theorists like to name, that Oswald was there saying he was going to, mumbling all this stuff about shooting Kennedy, and he was shooting at somebody else's targets and stuff like that. Is there any credibility to those, or what is your opinion on that?
Well, first of all, you look at the testimony, all of those witnesses contradict each other.
True.
One guy said he had a Texas Bulldogger hat on. They differed in the dates they said Oswald came out there. At least a couple of them listed a date where Oswald's presence is known. He was with Marina and Mrs. Payne, and not out there at the Sportsdrome shooting range. Um, so that all that testimony was not very impressive. If you just look at it closely, it's sort of all over the place. It's important to remember that people are impressionable. All right, they can put two and two together and get five. Like they hear, oh, there's this guy who shot Kennedy, and then they remember something that happened that stuck in their memory. Okay, and they probably don't remember the face of the fellow at the Sportsdrome. It would have to be several different people at different times, but they sort of connected in their mind, and probably they have an image of Lee Oswald at the Sportsdrome. So it's very unlikely they're just lying or making up stories. But people make connections like that. Like
there were a few, right? Yeah, there were a few other ones as well. Like for example, the used car salesman, the guy who said he had drilled in a telescopic lens to a rifle. There were a few other people who claimed.
But Oswald's rifle came with a telescopic lens already mounted on it. Yeah, and the car salesman said that the person who took the drive said, "Well, I don't have money now, but I'll come into money in a little while," which, gosh, would perfectly fit a conspiracy theory of Oswald being a paid assassin for somebody else. Like for example, okay, there are a bunch of sightings in Alice, Texas, of Lee, and often with Marina, and often with a babe in arms, doing different things. But they're all doing different things: looking for a job at a radio station, trying to rent a car, trying to take a bus to Dallas, etc. But at the time they happened, there was no babe in arms in the Oswald family. There was a toddler, June, but Rachel hadn't been born yet. So what are they connecting? They're connecting the image of the Oswald family, Marina with a babe in arms, and there's newsreel footage of Marina with a babe in arms, and the day after, actually the day of the assassination, and the witnesses say the guy spoke a foreign language to his wife. I would assume in Alice, Texas, they would know Spanish, so it had to presumably be another foreign language. And then they sort of connect these things. Oh, woman, babe in arms, foreign language, boom. Oh, yeah, that's the people we saw. I think that makes more sense than Marina and Rachel, or no, June, because Rachel was the babe in arms, but she wasn't born at the time, doing different things in Alice that make no sense. What's conspiratorial about looking for a job at a radio station, or trying to rent a car, or what would the point be? Why were and if it was people impersonating the Oswald family, again, what would the point be?
So I wanted to step back a little bit and ask you one last question, just kind of basic. And you cite how old you are or whatever. I'm 35 years old. I'm getting pretty old, so I'm just kidding. But
you're a young whippersnapper. But go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny because I've been to Dealey Plaza. I can't even tell you anything about it, right? But also, the big thing that happened in my time was 9/11, right? And 9/11 spurred just a crazy amount of conspiracy theories, especially because now it wasn't just the mainstream news. Now we had all of this new technology. Now we had the internet, we had social media, we had all this stuff kind of spurring it up.
Like that
we had all these new documentaries that came out saying that jet fuel was burning,
thermite and all that.
Yeah, right. So, and I know you probably studied a little bit about that too. Like, what do you think there was? Like I said, I don't know a whole lot about JFK and all that, but I feel like there was a lot of similarities between what happened after JFK and what happened after 9/11, where we didn't exactly know what happened. We knew it was really crazy, but the simple answer just wasn't enough for a lot of people.
I think that's essentially true. Um, I think like JFK conspiracy theories, um, 9/11 U.S. government conspiracy theories are sort of were people who leaned to the left and wanted to blame the Bush administration. Although, of course, you have people like Alex. Oh, what's his name?
Alex
Clint,
Jones. Yeah.
Alex Jones, who, he's so far to the right, he agrees with the left on every conspiracy theory you can possibly think of. There's an old cliche that the left and right continuum isn't really like a straight line, it's more like a horseshoe, and people at both ends are more like each other than they are like the people in the middle.
Man, yeah.
Uh, but I think there was a similar dynamic there. Some people, just didn't like the Bush administration, and particularly didn't like Dick Cheney and wanted to blame him. Other people wanted to sort of put on a facade of sophistication. I'm too sophisticated to believe what they're telling me. And this whole business of radical Islamic jihad. Well, how did they do something like that? And part of it is people don't want to believe some people can do something like that to America, right? I mean, aren't we the
most
technologically
powerful,
advanced, more powerful than any other nation, and also, more technologically advanced. At least we're more technologically advanced in some ways, and you might not know that. Whoever, the Germans are equally advanced in whatever. You just think America's technologically advanced. So how can it have it? It must have been some kind of stab in the back. It must have been something. And I can assure you that people in 1963 were shocked by the Kennedy assassination because they didn't believe people assassinated U.S. presidents anymore. If they'd had history, they knew about McKinley and Garfield. The Puerto Rican terrorist attack on Truman never really penetrated mass consciousness. So it's like, oh, this is America in 1963, We've just had Eisenhower as president and everything is nice and stable. And we've got Kennedy, this idealistic, glamorous new person. So this just doesn't happen. And then bang, bang, bang. Woo, it's a shocker. So I think 9/11 was like that. People were simply shocked that people could do that to America.
Yeah, I've always thought one of the reasons a lot of people believe or buy into conspiracy theories is that they don't want to accept that life is boring. Life is just boring for the most part, and they want to believe that there's more to it. There's more things going on behind the scenes that they can't see, to make it more interesting, like a movie or a video game or something.
Well, and what I want to say on top of that too, it's a defensive thing, right? So you could get through my defensive position that easy. Just all you got to do is just steal an airplane. I could fucking steal an airplane. Like anybody could steal an airplane, right? So I think that makes you feel really minuscule. That just some dude can kill 1,000 people.
Right. Important people don't have to be the ones to do important things. That a lone nut like Oswald, who was barely, scratching his way by in life, who was insignificant pretty much in every respect, right? He failed at nearly everything he did. He went to the Soviet Union. That didn't work out. He came back. He had a bunch of jobs that didn't work out. He tried to do the, what is it called? The Fair Play for Cuba Committee. That didn't work out. He got uncovered during that radio debate. Pretty much everything he tried to do, he failed at. I mean, he was a pretty insignificant person for the most part. So you want to think, I think a lot of conspiracies want to think that in order to kill, the most powerful person in the world, pretty much, the leader of the free world at the time, President Kennedy, had to be therefore taken out by somebody equally as powerful.
Yeah,
you have to create, the Cuban government, Castro, or the USSR, or the CIA and everything.
Yeah, that's the way of Manchester's theory, that you sort of want a symmetry. He says, like the Holocaust, although they're Holocaust deniers, but it's fundamentally not that hard to understand. You've got this massive evil, but on the other hand, you have the Nazi regime. So there's a kind of balance there.
Right.
You have this massive Nazi regime controlling a nation state on the one hand. Then you get a massive slaughter. It's evil, but there's a symmetry.
There's a parody there, yeah.
It sort of makes sense. And I think you're right. It doesn't make sense. The Nobody Oswald doing it. As not for 9/11, it makes a little more sense that the forces of Islamic Jihad, radical Islamic Jihad, perhaps could pull that off. But I think still not entirely. It's Americans just didn't think that. I guess it was 19 or probably 20 if you count the guy who didn't make it and some other people who put them up to it, could just do that kind of damage to the U.S.
Yeah, and even back then at the time, now we think of different radical Islamic groups as being more powerful, but back in 2001, it wasn't as well known in the American psyche at the time.
Correct.
Do you have any other questions you want to?
No, man, I'm good. We're hitting about 2 hours now, so I don't want to keep them all day.
Yeah. Well, the one point I want to make is I know you're really not going to convince anyone, right? For the most part, people who believe there's a conspiracy, you really can't necessarily change their mind. I think the one, they're going to bring up, they're going to say you didn't talk enough about the autopsy, you didn't talk anything about Jim Garrison's investigation, you didn't talk about this or that, or the back of his head being. They're going to bring up all these things, but we could be here for what? We could be here for 2 days, 2 weeks, talking about all this stuff, let alone 2 hours. But I think it's important for most people to realize that when you hear these claims, almost every one of these claims has an explanation to it. And I think that was the important thing for me. I did not know, when you talk to a conspiracy theorist, they're going to start rattling off a bunch of stuff real quick. And you're going to think, oh, wow, he's got all these facts. It must be true. But I think it's important to realize that there are explanations. And that's why I really appreciate your website. There are explanations to nearly every one of these. Perfectly plausible explanations to them.
Yeah, so, and I'd like to add that once you start understanding that you've been lied to or just badly misinformed by conspiracy theorists on one thing, two things, three things, four things, you kind of think, well, wait a minute, what else have I been lied to or misinformed about? And that sort of creates a kind of domino effect, which and so just getting people to know, oh, not everything you've been told is true is a big win.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
No. I guess that's it, man. That was. I had no idea there was so much to this. Like
Eric did not know what he was getting into.
No, and Greg and I just kind of barely, shoot. We kind of shoot the shit back and forth about JFK and stuff like that, but we never really get this deep. And I had no idea that there were this many people involved with it. This is so interesting. I'm gonna have to do my own more.
This is just
research now. Yeah, I got my own conspiracy theory now. I'm gonna have to start digging into.
Oh, and one more funny thing I just thought of. I actually heard. I think it was a joke, but kind of mocking the conspiracy theorists a little bit. They somebody jokingly said in a comment on a YouTube video I found. They said, they said JFK actually committed suicide in the limousine, and that the CIA created a conspiracy that they were involved just to cover up the fact that he committed suicide. So it was just kind of a mocking, continuing on just down the road to complete absurdity.
Yeah.
But well, remember there was South Park about the Bush White House welcoming 9/11 conspiracy theories, thinking, oh, people think we're incompetent, but now they think we're able to pull all that off. We'll take that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. It was really great, real good to be able to talk and discuss all the stuff that I've been reading through in my mind. And I know it's not. For our listeners, it's not necessarily a normal thing we do, but I think it has some connection there, right? I mean, the assassination was set during. We usually discuss military topics, but it was set during the, one of the most tense parts of the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, definitely
CIA elements.
I mean, talking about tactical operations, I mean, we all kind of learned now that assassinations don't really work. You could sit there and just kill somebody, but somebody's just going to fill that spot back in. So for a long time, I feel like everybody thought that was the thing to do. Oh, we'll just take the guy out. Who cares? Well, yeah. Well,
it's like a drug dealer or something. You take out Pablo Escobar, there's going to be someone else to take his place. Yeah,
it just floats right in, right? So it's not just the government or it's everything. It's just it encompasses everything, especially with what we do with the military and stuff. So,
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. I enjoyed it.
All
Take
right.
care.
Yeah,
You
take
too.
care, man. I appreciate it.